Hi, I'm Malika Bilal in for Femi OK, and you're in the stream. Today, the fight for transgender inclusion in the U.S. military. Our guest digital producer, Dan Ning, is here looking out for all of your feedback. And Dan, of course, you and I know that we're focusing today's show on the U.S., but as our community likes to tell us, this is a global conversation.
Yeah, they always like to keep it global in the AJ Stream community. So we're hearing about different policies of militaries around the world with regards to transgender people. And here's just one video we got from Bryn Tannehill.
There's over 15,500 transgender people serving the U.S. military today. They're the only federal employees that can currently be discriminated against just for being transgender. 18 or 19 of our closest allies allow transgender people to serve, including Australia, England, Israel, New Zealand, and Canada. I believe that we should look to them for the best practices and implement them here to allow our people to serve freely and openly.
So we want to hear from all of you at home. What is the policy on transgender people in your country's military? Tweet me with the hashtag AJStream.
Well, also here in the stream studio is Kristen Beck. And Kristen is a 20-year U.S. Navy SEAL veteran whose documentary Lady Valor tells the story of her coming out as transgender. Welcome to the stream, Kristen.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for being here. Now, we want to hear from you at home as well. Head over to stream.aljazeera.com to share your thoughts on this story, and you too could be in the stream.
Hi, my name is Ideological. I am an economist at the University de Portales in Santiago, Chile, and I am in the stream.
As transgender activists push for greater equality, their fight is increasingly focused on open service in the military. Similar to the U.S. military's repeal of the ban that barred gays and lesbians from serving, transgender inclusion would also require a change in policy. And that's something U.S. Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel says he's open to.
I do think it continually should be reviewed. I'm open to that, by the way. I'm open to those assessments because, again, I go back to the bottom line. Every qualified American who wants to serve our country should have an opportunity if they fit the qualifications and can do it.
However, some U.S. transgender activists believe the military is not a supportive environment for their community. Currently, trans soldiers openly serve in at least 12 countries, including the United Kingdom, Australia, and Thailand. So, is it time for greater inclusion? Well, here to help us answer that, in Washington, D.C., Landon Wilson, a U.S. Navy veteran who was discharged from the military in March after they discovered he's trans. In Washington State, Dean Spade, a law professor at Seattle University and founder of the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, a nonprofit providing free legal services to transgender, intersex, and gender nonconforming people. Also in D.C., Fiona Dawson, the host and producer behind Trans Military, a documentary looking at transgender soldiers serving globally. Welcome to the stream, everyone. Now, I want to start on my laptop. Kristen, this is a picture that we found in the archives. I'm pulling this up here, and this is a picture of Christopher Beck. Can you tell us about the person in this photo?
Well, Christopher Beck is me. And a lot of people talk about being born in the wrong body. I don't totally agree with that. You know, I was born in the right body. This is the body I was given. I take it as a challenge. I take it as part of my life and my life's journey. And I'm just trying to meet that challenge as best I can.
Well, then tell us a little bit about that journey and how you went from, being in the Navy SEALs, the elite of the elite here in the U.S., to who you are today.
Well, that person is still the person that's sitting in front of you. The beard and the SEAL teams and all those experiences and all that. And that's what builds the experiences, build in my search for knowledge is kind of where I'm at right now. And so I try to grow from all of his experiences. It was 20 years as a Navy SEAL. I was a member of Dev Group, also known as SEAL Team 6. And through so many experiences and so much trauma and anguish in my own mind with who I am, really made me make decisions along the way that I think were helpful to the military and to everyone overall. We need diversity. We need to have, the conversation has to be from everyone, not just from that one small minority of people who are in the SEALs right now. Mm-hmm. And I think we all kind of understand what I'm talking about. So it's a team that's dominated mostly by, middle-class white males who can swim really well.
Well, can you tell us, in our international audience that are watching, when you made that decision, really?
Well, I knew I was transgender probably when I was in grade school. I would say I was probably 3rd or 4th grade, a long time ago. So I always knew this was part of me. And I felt myself kind of an underdog and always kind of in that closet so deeply because it was something that society looks at kind of harshly. So I went into the SEAL teams kind of as that underdog, and I always felt I was that defender of justice and liberty in my own justice kind of way. So in the SEAL teams it's a tough place to go. About 1 person out of every 50 make it through the training. It's real tough to get into. And I think everybody's seen some of the movies and some of the programs and kind of understands what SEAL team people are. I retired in 2011, and that was kind of when I started my journey. So I started going out to some bars and seeing people and learning who I was, which was a difficult process. So it's basically a 45, 46-year-old going through puberty and kind of learning everything that a female would learn over years and years. I had to learn it in a few days. And so I think that's where a lot of our trouble comes, is that we're forced into situations that we don't really have the armor or the ability to handle. And it's just too bad that people don't give us the time to grow, as they've also been given that chance to grow as a person.
Armor, that's a good word for it, pun intended. Landon, your story is a little bit different. You were in Afghanistan when you were outed, and then within a matter of weeks discharged. Can you tell us what happened?
I was deployed to Afghanistan, where I was serving as my leadership had only seen me as male. So for the first time in my military career, I was able to fully be who I was. It opened a lot of doors for me, and it took away a lot of the worry that I had before. I was able to focus 100% on the job at hand. It was, ironically enough, my promotion that outed me as being assigned female at birth, which ended up in my being sent back to the States. And within, again, months, I was discharged just because of something that I couldn't control.
So, Landon, I'd like to read a tweet that we just got, and I want to get your response to it. Drew Lane, who's actually an Iraq veteran himself, tweeted, "Thank you for asking. All I can say is the military shouldn't discriminate against anyone or ask soldiers to hide who they are." And then he followed up, he said, "I spent years pretending I was straight, and that was just as damaging mentally as being in the war." So, Landon, can you relate to that as someone who was outed and then discharged?
Absolutely. We know that when you can come to work or to go anywhere as your full self, as your whole person, that makes it a tremendous difference in who you are and how you're perceived. And when you're in an environment as close-knit as the military, not being able to be who you are out of fear or worry that you're going to lose your career, you're building barriers between somebody that you would save their life if you had to. And that's not a fair ask of our troops.
So Landon, then what went through your mind that day that you found out you were being discharged?
When I was pulled from Afghanistan, my main concern was who was going to fill my position on the ground. Nobody was trained to do that at the moment, and I was pulled so quickly that I wasn't given the opportunity to explain how to do something or how to control my workstation. And still today, I don't know what happened. And that's the issue that we're running into, is that we're pulling good people who are doing good jobs and losing them because of a antiquated policy that can easily be changed.
There is opposition, of course, within the military, and you speak to that, Landon, really. And so I want to play this clip. This is U.S. Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel explaining the reasoning behind that. So have a listen to what he said in May.
Transgender is a bit more complicated because it has a medical component to it. These issues require medical attention. Austere locations where we put our men and women, in many cases, don't always provide that kind of opportunity. I do think it continually should be reviewed. I'm open to that, by the way.
You know, you hear him, he goes on and he says, I'm open to that, and we played that at the very top of the show. You, of course, have interviewed dozens of members of the military here in the U.S. and other places. What do you think that they feel about this and this policy, really?
For me, I think that there aren't enough stories out there. There's not enough education on what it truly means to be transgender, because we heard in that clip that we're talking about special medical needs and austere environments. And what I have found by interviewing people in countries where trans people can serve, that their medical needs are no more complicated than cisgender or non-transgender people's medical needs are. And I know that Landon can attest to that very well. I think that we oftentimes get wrapped upon the physical side of what it means to be a human being. Absolutely. And that stops us from really understanding that somebody is just as capable as serving, whether they're transgender or cisgender. And for me, this goes further than just being a transgender issue. It's a human rights issue, and it really focuses on gender discrimination and how we treat people differently, and how we also look at, we get confused between gender and sex assigned at birth. Everybody is assigned a sex at birth. We assume that their gender is going to match that, and not everybody's does. But just as the military is perfectly capable of addressing the medical needs of non-transgender people, other countries have demonstrated, and America can do this too, that medical needs should not prohibit service.
All right, Fiona, so beyond this question of the physical issues or needs here, we have a question, we have a tweet about culture. So I want to read this to you. Jared writes in, you don't get to have a unique, breaking the mold identity because the military isn't summer camp where everyone's differences are celebrated. Your job is to be one of many with a uniform objective and a uniform mindset. So Jared's saying that the culture really isn't open to this. What do you think about that?
I think that we need to realize that, well, first of all, let me say this. I have never served in the military, and I'm not transgender, so I cannot say that I have experienced this. So everything I say is on behalf of the stories that I have heard. The military is one of the most binary environments that you will ever find. And the trans people that I meet are not asking for that binary to change necessarily. All they're asking to do is to do their job with the gender that they know themselves to be. So as an example, there's a guy called Ben who is serving in the UK's Navy. He's a very similar age to Landon. He had a similar level of job. His story is a wonderful contrast to what happened to Landon. Landon, unfortunately, was discharged. In contrast, Ben came out to his chain of command, who then sat down with him, went through a needs assessment form, came up with a date on when all male pronouns would be used, when he would get his male uniform, when he would go into male barracks. I've met with the LGBT forum within the UK's Navy, and the commander there says, why would we not allow our transgender people to serve? Their careers have been invested in to an equal level. They're just as capable of doing their jobs. And when we allow diversity and inclusion within our workplace, which this is a workplace, then people perform better.
You know, Fiona, I think it's interesting you said the question that was asked was, why would you not allow trans people to serve? I want to pull up a stat here on my computer. An estimated 15,500 transgender service members are currently on active duty, guard, or reserve. And this is from a UCLA study, the Williams Institute. And as part of that study, this is another surprising stat. And Dean, I'll direct this your way. Trans people are twice as likely to join than cisgender people. And cisgender being people whose gender identity matches their biological sex. So Dan, you're opposed to this fight for inclusion, is that right?
That's true. I think this is not the right priority for the trans movement right now for a bunch of key reasons. One part of it is that this is often framed as a key way to have trans people have like economic opportunity, but you know, there's been extensive discussion in the U.S. through many inclusion fights about the ways in which a military job is not economic justice for a marginalized community. In the United States, being in the military means being abandoned in terms of your health care, facing severe levels of sexual violence. I'm sure you followed the outrageous scandals in the last few years about the level of sexual violence in the military, and the fact that even those who are supposed to enforce rules against sexual violence turn out to be engaged in sexual violence. There's been these outrageous scandals. 80% of people who are currently vets say that they are not getting what they need from the military. In general, the military is a very difficult job. an enormous percent of people who are homeless in the United States are vets, especially Black and Latino vets. So I'm concerned about the military service issue being framed as an answer to the severe problems of economic vulnerability that trans people face. And I'm also concerned because what the U.S. military does, and I'm glad the show has a global audience because I think the world knows this even more than people in the U.S., is promote U.S. imperialism, exploit people all around the world, and use gender and sexual violence as part of that. So I'm very concerned about the idea that when we engage in an inclusion campaign, we frame the military as this great, noble job protecting our country, which is, it's not a great job. As I mentioned, it's a job with terrible conditions, and we can talk more about that if you like, for all but the most elite, right? And it's a job doing something that I think shouldn't be done. So I think that the trans justice movement should be tied to a global justice movement, and it is tied to that. And the loudest demands in the trans movement over the years have been about addressing the poverty of trans people, the criminalization of trans people, and the ways that immigration enforcement is used against trans people, as trans people are dying in immigration prisons and U.S. prisons all over. So I think we're trying to imagine a really different framework instead of this really narrow conversation that portrays the U.S. military as a beneficial job and a great organization.
All right, so Dean, we're getting tweets that are agreeing with what you're saying, but I'd like to turn it to Kristen. So here Emma writes in, we need to be more bold about being anti-military. Lots of trans folks are, but we're scared of being seen as anti-equality. So Christian, this raises the whole question of who speaks for the transgender movement. Is it one unified movement?
No, not even close. I mean, you see here that if you had 4 transgender people in one room, you can have 4 totally different opinions. And that's fine. And that's what I fight for. I fight for the fact that you guys are here, Al Jazeera, you're here in America, and you guys are given a whole other point of view. I fought for that. I fight for religious freedom. I fight for all of our political views and everything else. That's why I was in the military. I fought for justice, equality, and liberty and everything else that is right about America. Now, we do mess up sometimes, but overall we do a pretty good job. And I agree with him in a few points, but I feel that if the military can get over this boundary, and it would be the toughest of the tough, can you imagine having a U.S. Marine Corps active duty transgender person? How could anybody else argue in any other workplace that being transgender is a burden, or it's medically not feasible, or anything else? Well, how about a transgender Navy SEAL? It's just, there's no arguments. If I can be transgender, I did my job, and I did my job well, then why is it a boundary to any other job place? I'm meeting with White House staffers later today, and we're talking about transgender healthcare. And we're talking about why a lot of these healthcare issues are coming up, that they're not treating transgender people. Now, if I can go into that room and I can speak about this, it kind of overtakes a lot of their arguments that it can't be done. Mm-hmm. Yes, it can be done, and yes, we are equal. We can do the job.
So then, Dean, I'll push that back to you. Isn't this, at the end of the day, just about equal opportunity in the workplace?
I think that's an argument that I hear a lot, is that this will help trans people be seen as full citizens. But I just have to ask, if we look at the history of inclusion campaigns in the U.S. military, many of the populations that are over-included in the U.S. military, people who are subjected to the most dangerous jobs, especially Black and Latino populations in the U.S., also face the worst violence at the hands of U.S. police, face severe job discrimination, healthcare discrimination. Getting access to military service does not turn out to change your status in the U.S. In fact, being overrepresented in the military has a high correlation with being some of the most vulnerable people in the U.S. So I think we need to really question that idea. And I do think that Kristen and I may just have very different perspectives on what the U.S. military does and is, and what its force in the world is. And I think that is a difference that may, inform our perspectives.
All right, so I want to shift to the question of what kind of reforms could and would happen. And Landon, I want to read this tweet to you, so take a listen. Abdul writes, it's a matter of acceptance. Part of it has to do with people's nature. The other is a matter of education and social impact. So on that question of education, Landon, what kind of education do you think needs to happen within the U.S. military itself?
Honestly, the experiences that I've had have led to a very widely accepted place. Most of the kickback that I've received have been from civilians, which has proven to me that the people in uniform, my leadership, my colleagues, are ready for this. So it's not a matter of if the military is necessarily ready for it, if our leadership is ready for it. It's when are we going to make it happen? And as far as the education is concerned, it's explaining the stories of what we're going through. When we have soldiers, sailors, airmen, and guardsmen who are being given shaving waivers because they're on hormones, but they're getting in trouble because their hair is too short and they're supposed to conform to female regulations. That's a problem, and our leadership needs to be aware of that. And it's about telling the stories of how, for our international troops, when you can go to work and not have to worry, you perform significantly better. When you have an inclusive environment that performs on diversity, you perform better.
You know, Fiona, this conversation has been in the headlines recently because there was a conference a few weeks ago in October of transgender military activists from around the world, and it happened in Washington, D.C., and it was about talking about experiences and sharing those. And so that leads me to what I'm going to play on my computer now. It's the experiences of people outside of the United States and militaries where transgendered military men and women are already serving. So I'd like all of our guests to have a look at this clip. This is Isla, and she is out of the UK, and she talks about the atmosphere there.
The whole ethos within the military was highlighted to me the day I came in to change my ID. So I transitioned, you know, I looked like this, and I had my old ID with my old photo on it. And of course I had to drive into the gates to pick up my new ID. I sheepishly showed the guard and said, look, explain the situation. And he was lovely. He's a grizzled old guard who's seen many years of, you know, very different situation in the military. And he just threw up a salute, said, don't worry, Mum, on you come. You're not the first, you won't be the last.
So Fiona, he said you're not the first, you won't be the last. You filmed this. What's the takeaway for it?
I was going to say, I recognize that clip. I can't claim credit for it. I know whose work it is, though. But I'm working with these guys to produce Transmilitary. But I mean, my takeaway is that this is not a big deal. That here in the I say here in the UK, here is an example where in the United Kingdom that somebody is not discriminated based on their gender or their gender identity, and that when other people get to know people, you find that the discrimination dissipates. I think going back to what Landon was saying about people knowing people, within the military, I'm finding in these stories that people are ready to accept and serve alongside their brothers and sisters. As a civilian, I don't think we have any right to say whether somebody should or should not serve. If somebody wants to serve, then that is their prerogative. And I can tell you right now that one of the stories that I'm filming is with a guy who just deployed within the last month. And I got to meet him, and I got to meet his family, his parents, his step-parents, and his sister. And all of them are completely supportive, and they love their son. They love him. They have loved him all his life. And I think that when families understand their children, because trans people are members of families, and when their stories are told with their families and with their friends, you'll find that you'll get the same acceptance here in America as we today see with Isla and her family in the UK.
Can I interject?
Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just concerned that and I don't think that's the intention of the program Transmilitary or other media coverage like it, or to some degree even potentially this program. But I do worry that what this actually produces is propaganda for the U.S. military and for other, harmful and brutal military regimes like Israel, which also accepts trans people. And I think, if I could just continue, I think that part of what this has been identified as is it's a program called pinkwashing, where if you label your military as a site of freedom and liberation for a marginalized group, then it can whitewash the realities of what that military is doing. And the U.S. military is under extreme, severe bad public reputation right now because of the
Dean, I'm going to pause you right there, Dean, because you sparked something. I would dare to say that you threw a grenade, and everyone wants to respond, and so we're going to have them respond in the post show because that's all the time we have for now. So we'll see you in the post show at stream.aljazeera.com. Thanks to all of our guests. Welcome to the Post Show. We've been discussing the fight for transgender inclusion within the U.S. military, and I dare say it was a fight just as we were ending the main show. So, Dean, if you could wrap up what you were saying, just summarize it for us in 2 sentences, and then we'll have Fiona respond.
I was just voicing my concern that the kind of portrayals of, service members that are part of the kind of work that Fiona's doing, as much as I respect her, I think it ends up being unintentionally propaganda for the U.S. military that covers over the brutal realities of the U.S. military regime with this new story about how it's a place for transgender freedom and liberty.
Fiona?
I would say that this programming is not about whether we should or should not have a military, and it's not necessarily about whether it is the right environment for people to work in. This show is about people who are giving their lives and who have families and who want to serve, and they should have every right. As an individual, personally, I can't stand guns. I hate warfare. I could never ever serve. Like, I really have no interest in being within the military, but I will fight tooth and nail for all Americans to have equal opportunity to serve if they so wish. And when you see the content, you will see that this is about people's lives, people with spouses, people with children, people with parents, people with siblings. And there's absolutely no reason why these people shouldn't be able to have their jobs.
So just beyond that point about individual lives, we have people talking about the overall issue of a civil rights struggle. And Kristen, I want to read you these tweets. So Emma writes in, "The military as part of a trans equality is a farce. We should learn the lesson from black inclusion in the military. That didn't prompt any further civil rights legislation. That took Brown versus Board of Education and bus boycotts." Those are 2 key moments in the civil rights movement, of course. That's what trans folks need, not the military. Kristen, what do you think about that? Do you think there's a line between military reform and civil rights movements?
I totally think there is. And I'd like to see the data that supports the fact that African American inclusion in the military had nothing to do with the civil rights movement. And I really believe that military inclusion of transgender people, and Dean, I totally disagree with a lot of things you're saying. If we have transgender people in the military, it's not going to pink wash or whitewash anything. What it's going to do is it's going to add a diversity and more color to our military, and maybe we can start making better decisions. I would rather have a commander up there that has an open mind and someone who could look at me as a person, as a human being. Wouldn't that commander make better decisions? And maybe some of that brutalism that you're speaking about, maybe some of that would go away if our military was more diversified. And I would love to see more people who study Islam and Muslims in our military, because that would also, it would make us more compassionate towards other cultures, because we would be a more colorful military. That's what I want, and that's exactly what I fight for. I fight for the fact that we should be as colorful and as diverse as possible. It makes us better people. You don't want to work for a company that's made up of a whole bunch of all the same people. Even here, when I'm walking around the studio, I see that you're made up of every culture, and every person is sitting here right working with you. This is a great place. I love this place because you have everyone here working together towards a good common goal. It's a common goal to get the news out.
I think that the diversity framework, while well-intentioned, has at this point been really demonstrated to be a tool in the arsenal of the U.S. military and other
well, so is your law education.
Programs. For example, the police have been diversified, but police brutality in the U.S. has skyrocketed, as we see in Ferguson and the protests around that. And in the period that we supposedly have seen racial equality in the U.S., we've seen the massive growth of the U.S. prison system to be the largest in the world and intensely targeted at Black and Latino people. So the idea that when you diversify something, it suddenly becomes equal is actually a current liberal myth that is what's operating. And I don't think that anyone has bad intentions who deploys that, but we have to think more critically about the way change actually happens and what it means to further invest in institutions that are immensely harmful to our communities by saying that we'll be liberated by being part of serving in them.
Well, and thinking more critically, Landon, I want to shift now to diversity in thought. Now, of course, after you were discharged and left the military, you told our producers that you spoke to some of those who you served with, and they told you that they wish they had known. Can you elaborate on what those conversations sounded like?
Yeah, I think to touch on the diversity aspect of things is that in my time being out in the community, I've learned very quickly that our community is made up of very diverse people, and that makes us a stronger community, right? And like Kristen touched on, is when you have different voices, different experiences, you make that community better. And that's the military community, that's your LGBT community, what have you. And in my experience, when people found out about what I had gone through and what I had been going through, it was all very positive and very much amazed that our military hasn't caught up to policies that other countries have adopted years and years ago.
You know, Kristen, sorry, go ahead, Landon.
No, go ahead.
It sounded like you'd finished your thought there, so I took the opportunity to jump in because I think it segues really nicely to what Kristen mentioned earlier, that later today, after you finish the stream, you are going on to the White House. What do you plan to tell those that you meet?
Well, I try not to say too much, so I want to hear what they have to say. I've met with White House staffers, I've met with people in the Pentagon also, and the fact is they are listening and they want to know. Across the board right now, healthcare is hit and miss as far as being transgender. It's provided, it's not provided. Right now, the VA, the Veterans Administration, is providing transgender people hormones and other medical practices, but they're not doing surgeries, they're not doing a lot of other things. And so it's really a hit and miss thing. Well, if this is a medical necessity, then it should be provided. Mm-hmm. And I do agree, and Chelsea Manning wasn't really brought up, but she is fixing a lot of things in the prison system. And I applaud her for that there are problems in the prison systems. Now, if this is a medical necessity and Chelsea is transgender, then she should have the surgery, should have her hormones, and should be treated with dignity and respect, no matter what, is going on in the background. Now, I applaud her for that, and just that same frame of thought should be brought into all of medical, all of healthcare in America, and then also in the VA, and then in the military. And when Secretary Hagel was speaking about the medical and other necessities for transgender in the field, it's all BS. It's not correct. We have people in the military right now with diabetes. We have people in the military with all kinds of other things. They bring some pills in the field with them. They do the other things. And we're not out there for months and months and months. And you're not going to get your surgery while you're in the field if you need surgery. So all of it, there's no argument.
Well, Kristen just gave us her message for the White House, but we unfortunately have to leave it there. I will end, though, with the community. Dan, what are the final thoughts?
So we had a debate on this show, and there's a debate online as well that reflects the debate on this show. So if you read on my screen here, Elliot writes, safety for trans people cannot come from institutions that systematically cause harm to millions of marginalized people. But then on the other side, we have Ken, who writes, all capable volunteers should be allowed. We show our strength in diversity and our weakness in prejudice. So that's the last from the community.
And of course, the conversation will continue online. I want to thank all of our guests for joining us. Now on the next show, Zero Tolerance for Barbaric Cultural Practices. That's the name of a proposed Canadian bill targeting immigrants. We'll tell you what it's about and why it has many in an uproar. And until then, we'll see you online.